Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to the Great War. In the early 1920s, Central America was experiencing political instability which dated back to the 19th century. There had been several attempts to stabilize the volatile republics in the region by creating a Central American federation, but these had failed. Border clashes, civil wars, and coups were common, especially among the smaller nations. These conflicts also took on an international dimension when US geopolitical and business interests got involved, as they often did. In this episode, we'll take a look at a series of conflicts in Panama, Honduras, and Nicaragua, which typify the so-called banana wars of Central America up until 1921, exactly 100 years ago. In the late 19th century, Central America took on a new strategic importance. One of the main reasons was the potential for a shipping canal that would link the Atlantic and the Pacific, not only for commerce, but also for warships. The United States had shown some interest as early as the 1850s, but the French were the first to actually start building a canal in 1881. They began digging through the narrow Panama Isthmus, which was under the control of Colombia at the time, but by 1888, the French company went bankrupt with the canal just 40% complete. In 1903, the US struck a deal to buy the assets of the former French company for $40 million. The Colombian government, though, still needed to give its approval since it had conceded the right to dig to the French back in the 1880s. Colombia had just emerged from a bloody civil war and was desperately short of money, which led some politicians to suggest that it should simply wait until the original concession ran out in 1904, and then the French assets would simply fall to Colombia. US President Theodore Roosevelt was outraged, as he told his Secretary of State, "I do not think the Bogota lot of jackrabbits should be allowed permanently to bar one of the future highways of civilization." Luckily for Roosevelt, a solution was not long in coming. There was a group of Panamanian separatists who wanted independence from Colombia, and now they asked the US for help. They received a cryptic response through an intermediary to the effect that US warships could be on the Atlantic coast in 36 hours and on the Pacific in 48. The Panamanian separatists took the hint and announced independence on November 3, 1903. The USS Nashville moved into the area to prevent a Colombian retaliation, which resulted in a near bloodless revolution in Panama. Roosevelt and the Panamanian government then struck an agreement which gave the US a 16-kilometer wide zone to build the canal, with, quote, all rights, power, and authority, as if it were the sovereign of the territory. In exchange, Panama became a US protectorate. One historian described the turn of events as follows. Panama became a rare recorded instance of a country that declared its independence and gave it up at the same time. By 1914, the Panama Canal was complete, and Roosevelt's actions ushered in a new era of US involvement in Central America and the Caribbean. In time, the US adopted so-called dollar diplomacy to influence the region by financial control. And in the early 1900s, big business meant bananas. Bananas started out in the US as a delicacy, but by 1914, they were the second most popular fruit after apples. US companies imported up to 50 million bunches a year, which meant an increase in revenue from $250,000 in 1901 to $13 million in 1910. The fruit was especially popular amongst working-class Americans because it was cheap and could be easily brought to dirty work sites in its protective peel. Banana excitement even spawned a hit song in 1923 called Yes, We Have No Bananas. It wasn't long before companies got very interested in the banana business. In 1899, the Standard Steam Navigation Company and the Boston Fruit Company merged to create the United Fruit Company, which soon became a giant multinational. United Fruit was known for its aggressive business tactics, which included undercutting rivals and buying up huge swaths of land in Central America. Eventually, the company owned over 3 million acres in Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, and Jamaica. Up to a third of this land was jungle, but owning it prevented rival companies from expanding. On United Fruit's plantations, company laws were gospel. The company had its own security forces, its own spy network, and troublesome workers were unwelcome. Some were even lynched. To keep cash within the company, United Fruit paid its workers in vouchers that could only be used in company stores. So by the early 1900s, United Fruit was expanding so fast that it earned itself the nickname the Octopus. And now, the company wanted to get into the most lucrative banana-producing region in Honduras. And if you wanted to do business in Honduras, you needed to do business with Sam the Banana Man Zemurray. Zemurray was a banana entrepreneur who was especially known for risky ventures in Honduras. United Fruit actually bought 60% of his company, but was then forced to sell it back to him to comply with antitrust laws. But Zemurray couldn't afford his own shares and therefore was secretly in debt to United Fruit. In 1907, political events put United Fruit's lucrative operations in Honduras at risk. General Manuel Bonilla, dictator and friend of United Fruit, was overthrown by both the Honduran and the Nicaraguan armies. In 1910, United Fruit offered to build railways in Honduras in exchange for land and concessions, but new President Miguel Davila refused. But the exiled Bonilla and Sam Zemurray had other ideas. They hired a group of American mercenaries, including Lee Christmas and his partner Guy Machine Gun Maloney, and bought an old US Navy vessel, the Hornet. The conspirators landed at Trujillo and joined with local supporters and fighters from Guatemala who were most likely hired by United Fruit. The coup was a success, and Bonilla was quickly reinstated despite US attempts at mediation. The US had done little to stop the coup, and American warships had watched as Bonilla arrived. Privately, President William Howard Taft was irritated, since the US was attempting to bring Honduras under its economic control through dollar diplomacy. But he also didn't want to get into a fight with United Fruit. The company denied all involvement, but it did benefit greatly from Zemurray's coup. Zemurray received land and tax breaks from Bonilla, which he then passed on to United Fruit in order to cover his debt. And once he was free of the octopus, Zemurray became United Fruit's main rival and eventually president of United Fruit himself. According to journalist Peter Chapman, the Honduran episode would mark a turning point for United Fruit. The events of 1911 in Honduras brought an end to what might be termed the United Fruit Company's nice guy period. There would be little more of that. United Fruit had established its power and was of every mind to wield it. So United Fruit had established itself as a power in Central America, but it wasn't the only one, and the US government also did not hesitate to get involved. Nicaragua was one of the countries of interest to the US, since for some time it was considered a potential location for a transoceanic canal. American business interests, however, also loomed large, especially around the coastal town of Bluefields. In 1909, conservative rebels, including many Americans, overthrew President José Santos Zelaya. Zelaya had been accused of hostility towards US business interests, and he was forced to resign when US Marines arrived to protect US citizens. He was replaced by Juan José Estrada, who in turn was replaced by Adolfo Diaz in 1911. Diaz was a supporter of the US and had his own business interest in Bluefields as well. But the closer he got to the United States, the more enemies he made in Nicaragua. Minister of War General Luis Mena, with the support of the army, soon called for Diaz's resignation. The US intervened diplomatically to support Diaz, so Meña's troops cut off electricity to the capital and bombarded the city for 4 hours. Now that violence had broken out in Nicaragua, the US once again sent in the Marines under Major Smedley Butler, whose troops arrived in August 1912. Butler's orders were not to go after the rebels, but to secure the main railway line and keep any fighting away from it. In September, Butler commandeered a train and headed down the line towards Granada. The rebels had sabotaged the lines with liquid from milkweed, which caused the train's wheels to slip so much that the Marines actually had to get out and push. Once they finally arrived at Masaya, the Americans were ambushed by a rebel force of 150 horsemen. Butler ordered the train to drive straight through the attack. It was a gorgeous spectacle. A sheet of fire was spitting into the darkness on both sides of the road. 400 Marine rifles were popping with tongues of flame, and 16 machine guns were rattling out a staccato beat. The engines were screaming and puffing, all in one little narrow street. Meña said the attack had been a mistake, but the political damage had been done. Butler ordered Meña to resign, which he did, but some of his commanders had decided to hold out. General Benjamin Zeledon, whose troops had originally attacked Butler, moved his 800 men into defensive positions on 2 fortified hills overlooking Masaya and dug in. On October 4th, about 1,000 Marines and sailors and 4,000 Diaz supporters surrounded the hills. In the night, the Marines crept up the first hill and took it by storm. Then they turned the captured artillery against the second hill, which soon fell as well. In the half-hour battle, about 30 rebels and 4 Marines were killed. By October 6th, the Nicaraguan rebels had been completely defeated. Diaz's presidency was secure, and his government erected a memorial to US forces. We desire that our elder sister, the great Republic of the United States, so wise, so powerful, will bring to us permanently the benefits which all her sons enjoy throughout all her vast and peaceful domain. The opposition Nicaraguan press was less enthusiastic and attacked Butler and his home state personally. They described the US intervention as, quote, "the blonde pigs of Pennsylvania advancing on our garden of beauty." The US would remain in Nicaragua until 1933 and was often accused of rigging elections, a claim that even Butler did not dispute. The Nicaraguan occupation of 1912 marked a turning point, since it was the first time US forces had actively gone into battle to suppress a revolution. US interventions after Nicaragua were concentrated on the Caribbean, but in 1921, both conflict and US forces would return to Central America once again. One of the main reasons behind the numerous conflicts between Central American states was border disputes. Many of the borders ran through poorly mapped jungle, which was a problem when even small parcels of land were hugely important to the small nations. A prime example of this kind of conflict was the Coto War between Costa Rica and Panama in 1921. At the center of the conflict was the tiny disputed village of Koto, which was home to just 27 families. In 1914, the US confirmed a prior judgment which awarded the village to Costa Rica, and they ordered the Panamanians to withdraw, even though Panama was a US protectorate. This was politically impossible for Panamanian President Belisario Porras, who was under pressure not to give away any land. In December 1919, Costa Rican President Julio Acosta Garcia called on Panama to finally accept the decision. Although Costa Rica was militarily stronger than Panama, Porras delayed withdrawal in the hopes that the US would protect its protectorate. The Costa Ricans then announced to the US their intention to occupy Koto, but the Americans did not respond. Acosta assumed that the US wasn't interested and sent 28 soldiers to the village who quickly overwhelmed the single Panamanian police officer. This set off a firestorm of nationalist sentiment in Panama, which put Porras under even more pressure. Panama didn't have an army, so volunteers gathered to try to create one, but they were short of weapons. In the end, the 1,000-man Panamanian police force was converted into a makeshift army. Porras tried to avoid a conflict and even made a bold public statement. War between Panama and Costa Rica over valueless land is an absurdity. In response, an angry mob stormed the Senate and Porras was saved by US forces. So a tiny village had brought Panama and Costa Rica to the brink of war. Neither president truly wanted it, but domestic political pressure by nationalists demanded action. And so, in February 1921, the Coto War began. The war started well for Panama in spite of its military weakness. President Porras had heard that the Costa Ricans were going to reinforce their troops in Koto, and so he sent General Manuel Quintero with a scratch force of policemen turned into soldiers. When they arrived, the Costa Rican garrison simply withdrew without a fight. Quintero now laid plans to ambush any boats coming across the border by river. On February 27th, his forces ambushed a Costa Rican boat and captured a machine gun, which they then used to capture another boat carrying 100 Costa Rican troops 2 days later. But these were minor victories, and the Panamanians were still desperately short of weapons and ammunition. The next clashes took place on the Atlantic coast. On March 4th, the Costa Ricans commandeered a United Fruit train and crossed the border on the Sihuola River. The Panamanians didn't dare to blow up the bridge over the river since it was also owned by United Fruit, and simply withdrew. President Acosta now ordered an advance deeper into Panama. Privately, though, he actually hoped to provoke a US intervention to end a war that he didn't want. 1,200 Costa Rican soldiers armed with 17 machine guns and 3 cannons now prepared to land on the island of Bocas del Toro. The US promptly sent warships to the area and forced a stop to the fighting on March 5th. Costa Rica had won the military conflict, but both sides actually benefited from the war politically. Porras made a show of wanting to continue the fight, but only to satisfy the Panamanian nationalists, knowing full well that the US wouldn't allow it. The presence of US forces was also a convenient excuse for Acosta to withdraw Costa Rican troops from Panamanian territory. In June, Panama sent diplomat Narciso Garay to Washington to plead their case. They were disappointed in the lack of support from their protector and asked that the Koto decision of 1914 be reconsidered in Panama's favor. The US refused, so Garay wrote a lengthy letter of protest. The acts carried out by the government of Costa Rica under the protection of the United States will be impotent to kill or weaken Panama's right to continue to occupy Panamanian territory. The Koto judgment only proves that in the present state of the world, force still governs relations between the two countries, and that the rights of the people are only valid in direct proportion to the rifles, machine guns, and cannon that they have to back them up. Costa Rica finally occupied Koto peacefully in September 1921. The Coto War and the other conflicts in the Banana Wars period had a profound effect on the states and peoples of Central America. US interventions would cause long-lasting political, economic, and social issues. But were the Banana Wars really about bananas? Well, the answer is a bit complicated. United Fruit and other companies certainly played a role, and contemporaries often assumed that they had a hand in the US interventions. One observer wrote of the Coto War, "The United States intervened, whether in compliance with her protective treaty obligations towards Panama, or to protect the United Fruit Company's extensive plantations near Bocas, it is not possible to say. In fact, the US government and United Fruit were often at odds in Central America. US senators from both parties tried to introduce taxes and antitrust laws to slow United Fruit's growth, and the company's deals with local governments were often at odds with Washington's dollar diplomacy. Some historians have argued that US financial domination of Central America was not just about money, but about keeping other powers out of the region in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine. According to this argument, many Central American states owed money to European powers who might be tempted to intervene in the case of political instability or collapse. US hegemony, therefore, could be maintained by financial and economic domination. But for two-time Medal of Honor recipient and Banana Wars veteran Smedley Butler, the wars were about money. Butler became disillusioned with the US role in the region and went on a speaking tour of the country. He later summed up his feelings this way: "I spent 33 years being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1916. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenue in. I helped in the rape of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street." In 1921, though, these debates were a long way off for Butler and for the people of Central America. Butler and the Marines would return to Nicaragua in 1929 to put down another revolution, and US interventions in the region continued for years to come. And for the United Fruit Company, business was still booming. It was a fascinating process for us here at the Great War Channel to bring you this episode about the Central American Banana Wars. But as usual, there are always some bumps in the road. We need to face the realities of being history creators on YouTube in 2021, which means we can't completely rely on this platform anymore. That's why we crowdfunded and released our Battle of Berlin documentary, 16 Days in Berlin, specifically outside of YouTube, because 250 of our YouTube videos were retroactively demonetized because YouTube changed their rules years after these videos were originally made. And in this kind of climate, we went even further to be safe in the future. We teamed up with some other creator friends to have a platform where we don't have to worry about YouTube's capricious actions. This platform is called Nebula. On Nebula, you can watch top educational creators like us ad-free and support them at the same time. For example, this video that you're watching now does not have this very ad on Nebula. And we can publish content there which we can't put on YouTube, like our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin, which I mentioned earlier. We want to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. As usual, if you want to know what sources we use for the episode, you can find them in the video description. And if you want to support our channel, which we hope you do, you can do so on Patreon, and the link for that is in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1921, a production of Real-Time History, and the only YouTube history channel that hopes that you find our banana-based history appealing.